All right. Should I just get started? How are we doing?
Please do.
Did you want to wait just to get started? Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So let's see how I do here. I never use Teams, so I might need sharing.
If you see in the top right next to the leave button, see the red leave button? There you go.
Yep. Is that?
Yep.
Let's see.
Yep.
All right.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So thanks for having me. And yes, this has been great. So as Ben said, at the top of my CV is the talk I gave to your group a while ago. Before that, people would say, yeah, you did all this stuff. But if you given a talk and discussed with these guys, the answer was always no, and people were disappointed. So Ben's helped me address that huge gap in my CV. So nice to be back. So this is going to be on the ethics of recruitment and retention in clinical trials. And I'll give you the takeaway message at the beginning, which is that I think that recruitment and retention is really important, but it doesn't get a whole lot of attention in the ethics research, ethics literature. And I also think, and this is based on about 28 years of IRB experience, I don't think IRBs do a very good job. I don't think investigators do a very good job. I don't think institutions do a very good job with recruitment and retention. And I think part of that is just because nobody's clear whose job it is. It always seems like it's somebody else's job. And I think we all need to do better. So that's the take-home lesson. You don't have to get anything else out of this talk. You can just nap and check your email for the rest of it if you want to. So I work at the NIH, but I make up most of the stuff that I say. So here's the way I think about subject selection. I think about it in three aspects. There's selection, and that's basically determining who can get into the trial through inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then once you determine the whole pool of potential participants through the inclusion-exclusion criteria, you try to recruit people from within that pool, get them to enroll in the study, and then hopefully you try to retain them for the duration of the study. So for this talk, I've written on selection before. I think there's interesting topics there. But for today, I'm just going to focus on recruitment and retention and bracket subject selection, or the ethics of subject selection. So here's the point, which is just that retention and recruitment aren't just pragmatically or scientifically important. They're really important ethically. Why is that? Well, as I've argued and people have argued a lot, in order to be ethical, clinical trials have to have social value. If they don't have social value, then it's unethical. You're wasting resources and you're wasting participants' time, even if you have low risks and you get informed consent. You need to have socially valuable studies that can collect socially valuable data. But in order to do that, you need to not only enroll enough people into your studies, but you need to keep them in your studies. And that suggests that recruitment and retention are ethically critical to clinical research. The problem is that we just do absolutely terrible at this. There are lots of data which suggest a quarter, a third, even more of trials don't recruit enough subjects, and a lot of studies are stopped as a result. I always thought when I came to the NIH and sat on IRBs and DSMBs that all of the interesting work would be on thinking about the science and how to do that right, thinking about the ethics and getting that right. But so many of my IRB meetings and so many of my DSMB meetings just end up being concerns and hand-wringing over the fact that we're just not getting enough people into our trial. So we need to do a lot better. So here's the dilemma. When I sit on IRBs and somebody says, we haven't gotten enough people into the study, we want to stop it, I used to have some fellow IRB members would say, well, there's no ethics there. If they want to stop, they just get to stop. All we care about is subject protection. And if they're going to stop, there are no subjects to protect. So I think that's a big mistake. And I think it's a mistake because if you've started the study, if you've devoted resources to it, if you enrolled participants in it, then they've done some things. And you're just wasting their efforts if you stop the study before you get valuable data. On the other hand, if you continue the trial, knowing pretty sure you're never going to get a sufficient number of participants, then you're just going to waste more efforts and the contributions of more people. So I think this is the dilemma that at least the IRBs I sit on find themselves in all the time. We don't want to keep them going if they're not going to finish, but we don't want to stop them given that they've already enrolled people. So I think the goal is, I don't think there's a solution to that dilemma. I think the solution is to avoid being in that dilemma in the first place by being proactive and making sure that we get enough people enrolled into our trials and we keep them in trials for a long enough time. And here's the point I was making at the beginning. I think a lot of the problem is it's not clear whose job this is. So I talk to fancy investigators around here all the time. They have their jobs, the fellows have their jobs, the nurses have their jobs, and nobody really thinks it's the job of that person or somebody else. Nobody knows whose job it is to make sure we get people in and keep them in trials. So I think we need to do a better job of this. And I think one thing IRBs can contribute to this is just pushing investigators up front. What's your plan for making sure you get enough people in your study? And what's your plan for making sure you keep them long enough to get valuable data and make their efforts and their time worthwhile? So that, I think, is the really critical point from the perspective of IRBs. And as I'll go through this, I'll just suggest, I think that doing that raises a number of interesting ethical issues, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about. So here's the point is, obviously, we want to get the right balance. We want to make sure we recruit and retain, but we've got to do it in an ethically acceptable way. An obvious way to get enough people and keep people in a trial is just say you can't leave the trial, right? Say, once you're in, you're stuck. Well, that's unethical. We can't do that. So we got to find better ways to actually keep people in, get them in the trials, and keep them in ethically appropriate ways. Okay, so I'm going to talk about recruitment first, and then I'll talk about retention of people who have been recruited and enrolled. So the obvious idea is that recruitment should be based on two things. It should be based on science and it should be based on ethics. It shouldn't be based on who's easier to recruit. It shouldn't be based on who's rich. It shouldn't be based on who's poor. So it's trying to identify the appropriate people for the study and going after them in terms of recruitment targets. So one of the things that we found, so if you talk to people in research ethics, they'll say, at least for a lot of studies, now this isn't true for a lot of other studies, but there are studies for which inclusion of minority groups is on the low side. Now, I'd be interested in hearing about Washington Hospital Center. I assume it's probably not as much of a problem for your group, although I'll be interested in talking about that. But I think, and we did a study once that suggested that the studies that have trouble recruiting individuals from minority groups, it's not so much trust in the study and trust in investigators, which a lot of people talk about. It's really often more prosaic things like, where's the study being conducted? Can people get to those studies? Can they afford bus fare if they need bus fare? Is there a bus that goes there? Do they have somebody to look after their kids while they're in the study? So it's these more basic things that I think have a much bigger impact. And again, it's the things that we need to be aware of and be proactive about. So one of the things is choosing the site. So this is just the example from the NIH. We're stuck and this building is not moving from north of Bethesda, Maryland, which is a pretty wealthy, pretty white place. It does have a metro stop, so that helps a little bit. But what NIH is trying to do is reaching out and trying to team and collaborate with groups in other places where there's access to a broader range of participants. And so the Cardoza Clinic, which used to be on 14th Street, was one of the really nice examples of this from some NIH institutes. So thinking about where you're doing the study as the beginning of recruitment of a broad and diverse population. And there's lots of different ways to do recruitment. And one of the ways is offering various sorts of incentives to researchers, to clinicians. So I know a study that I reviewed a couple of years ago where they were offering $2,000 for every participant that a clinician referred. So every time a clinician referred one of their patients to the study, they got $2,000. That's a pretty good amount of money even for clinicians. One of the things we've been talking about lately is, is incentives to participants. So you enroll somebody in the study, you think they might know other people who are eligible for the studies. You offer incentives to your participants to refer others. So let's talk about that one in a minute. I think that's a really interesting approach in terms of possibly being effective, but also concerns about the ethics. There's also targeted recruitment, and there's advertising, which I'll talk about a little bit. So there's all these sorts of incentives to try to get people into trials. And on the one hand, to the extent that they're effective, and there's some data which suggests that they are effective, then ethically they can be a good thing, although there are obviously things to pay attention to and potentially worry about. So when it comes to incentives for clinicians and researchers, one of the big worries is whether or not those incentives encourage investigators to refer and or enroll people who aren't appropriate. So if you're a clinician and somebody offers you $2,000 if you refer somebody to a study, does that increase the chances that you'll refer somebody who faces high risks from the study or somebody who isn't appropriate for that study? This is the point I mentioned a minute ago. A lot of studies at NIH are starting to do this, where they're offering incentives to participants. And there are a number of studies which suggest that this approach actually has a couple of really important values and virtues to it. One of which is that it looks like it can be, in certain cases, an effective way to enroll difficult to reach populations. So I used to be on the drug abuse IRB, and enrolling people who have various drug addictions can be really hard. But people who have drug addictions tend to know other people who have drug addictions. And we started offering some incentives to the individual participants if they referred others who are eligible for the study. So what are some worries about that? The first worry our IRB had was a worry about privacy. If I refer somebody else, if I refer Ben to go in the study, Ben knows I'm in the study, and Ben knows what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are for the study, then he knows something about me medically or clinically. So if you have to have HIV infection, or if you have to have a cocaine addiction to be in the study, then Ben already knows something about me just in virtue of the fact that he knows I'm in the study. Another worry is that if I get money, so if I refer Ben and I only get money if Ben actually enrolls in the study, not just that he's eligible, but he actually decides to enroll, then there's worries about whether or not I might pressure him to enroll in the study so that I can make the money that I'm being offered. So offers the potential to recruit difficult to reach populations, but raises some serious concerns. So advertising, I take the Metro to work every day, and there seems like more and more advertising on clinical research, and it plays an important role. And I think one of the things that IRBs are grappling with is trying to figure out what's appropriate and what's inappropriate advertising. The FDA has guidance on this. It doesn't say that much that's very helpful. One thing that's important is the FDA says that advertising is the start of the informed consent and subject selection process. So one important implication of that is that IRBs are supposed to review the ads ahead of time and make sure they're appropriate. Now, what are you supposed to look at? Well, according to FDA, not supposed to promise a cure. You're supposed to use appropriate font sizes. You're not supposed to overemphasize payment or the amount of payment. Obviously, those things all seem reasonable, but they beg lots of questions about what's an appropriate font size and what does it mean to emphasize or overemphasize payment. Here's one example of a proposed ad that actually didn't get approved. This was an ad for a study that had this very dramatic thumping bass music and these swirling tie-dye colors. And it had this booming James Earl kind of voice that came on and said, "Attention, alcohol users." And it was very dramatic. It was very attention grabbing. And the researchers thought it could be very effective at getting people's attention. And what was interesting is that very attention grabbing aspect of it made the IRB nervous. And the IRB was a little nervous that it was somehow too attention grabbing. And the investigator worried that the IRB's view in the end was that we thought ineffective advertising was not worth the money, And we thought effective advertising was ethically inappropriate, and he couldn't figure out anything that we would allow. So here are some of the questions to worry about. Does advertising affect which groups enroll? Does it affect understanding? So here's one of the worry that people have described, which is a worry that if the ad is too catchy, then the ad itself might convince people, oh, I'm going to enroll in that study before they know anything about the risks, the potential benefits, and the other important aspects of the study. Another interesting question is just whether or not advertising affects subject motivations. And a further question, which might be worth our discussing, is whether or not ethically we care. So does it matter if somebody's eligible, if somebody's willing to be in the study, if somebody consents to being in the study, if someone does everything they're supposed to do as part of the study, then it's also a matter ethically why they're doing those things and why they enrolled in the study in the first place. So how much do we care about motivations independent of their impact on participant behavior? So then that brings us to payment. What role should it play? How much should we pay? To what extent is it acceptable to advertise payment? This is the question I mentioned a minute ago with the FDA guides. What does it mean to not emphasize payment in practice? So here's another real example from the same IRB. So this was a study of smokers, which in the business, at least at the time, they called chippers, which are people who don't regard themselves as smokers, but when they go out to a bar with friends, they'll bum a cigarette off their friends after they've had a couple of drinks. And these individuals were very hard to identify and get into a study. So what the investigator proposed was to create bar coasters. So a lot of chippers start chipping cigarettes from other people after they've had a couple drinks at a bar. So he was going to make up these coasters, and this is what it was going to say. It was going to say you could earn $50 to $1,295. Here's the number, call it if you're interested. And so the question for us just was whether or not that ad, and now it was the only difference, this is actually the ad, the phone number's been changed, but it was also circular. It was a real bar coaster. My techniques with PowerPoint didn't let me make it circular, but is that appropriate or is that somehow overemphasizing the amount of money? It's in the second line. Should it be in the fourth line? Should the font be a little bit smaller? Would it be okay to bold it? At one point, the investigator wanted to bold it. So a lot of questions that we can ask about specific ads, and I'd be really interested in what everybody thinks of these. So in general, what's the worry with advertising? So the worry people used to have is that advertisings would undermine understanding. As the way I said before, if you advertise and you offer payment, then people are just focused on those things and they don't pay attention to things like the risks. There was also worries about altruism. Maybe if we're advertising and paying people a lot of money, then people will stop being in research for altruistic reasons and start being in it for the money, which is the question, the ethical question of motivations that I mentioned just a minute ago. So these are some references. Ben might recognize these. Luke Jelinek is an ex-fellow from our department, and Emily Largen is also an ex-fellow who wrote papers on this a couple of years ago. So there's not a ton, but there's a fair amount of empirical research now. And to the extent that the research is there, again, we can have more studies, but the studies that are there suggest these really aren't worries. That in fact, if you look at the data that we have, people who are concerned about payment actually pay more attention to the risks rather than less. That people who are out for the money really are serious about looking at the risks and making sure the risks are not too high. And then there was another paper, this is the bottom one by Scott Halpern and his group at Penn, where they tried to assess whether or not increasing the payment would affect willingness. So the worry some people had was if you pay a lot, then there's a point at which people just stop paying attention to risks and they'll just go into the study, which would suggest that willingness at some point should go way up as a function of payment. And it turned out they found out that just didn't happen, that there wasn't any cut point where all of a sudden people were just saying, I'll be in the study because it pays so much money. So those are some of the old worries, and it looks like, at least according to the existing data, we shouldn't worry about them too much. But there's this new worry, and this another fellow of ours, the second one by Neil Diekert was a fellow in our department. He's now a cardiologist at Emory. And I think this is a really serious concern that IRBs need to think about, which is that the worry is that if you pay people, then they might misrepresent themselves in one way or another. So if you say to somebody, yeah, you can be in the study, you can make $1,000. To be in the study, you have to have a history of using cocaine 4 or more times a month for the last year. Well, if people know that that's an inclusion criterion, then you can bet you're going to find more people who suddenly have the history that they need to have to be in the study. So they might misreport their history. They might also misreport side effects. They don't want to tell you that they got a headache from the drug because they're worried that that's going to result in their being dismissed from the study and they're losing out from future money that they would have made otherwise. So what can you do about this? So people have been trying to come up with safeguards that allow us to use payment, because payment is effective at recruiting subjects, to use it in order to recruit a sufficient number of participants without undermining the honesty and the accuracy of the data that we get. So one obviously is, just to the extent you can, rely on objective measures for inclusion, exclusion criteria rather than just self-report. For some things, there are objective measures. For other things, there just aren't. Another thing is to try to figure out how the payment schedule goes. So maybe you use a little bit of incentive payment at the end, but if you have a lump sum payment at the very end, that's really going to encourage people to stay in the study and downplay side effects. Whereas if you use a prorated and sequential payment scheme, maybe you'll get more people willing to be honest. This is this third bullet is a debate our IRB had for a while, which was the worry was that you bring somebody in, you get their history, and you say to them, well, you don't qualify. And they say, why don't I qualify? Now, if you explain exactly why they don't qualify, if you explain exactly what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are, there's the worry that that person's going to then go back. They're going to explain what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are to their friends, and then their friends are going to be in a position where they can misrepresent their history to be in the study. So we discussed this for a couple of months at IRB, and we decided in the end that the investigators, when they don't have objective measures for the inclusion and exclusion criteria, they should minimize the extent to which they disclose precisely what the criteria are to the participants. So they take the whole history without saying explicitly what the cutoffs are in terms of history and experience. This is another one I was kind of hinting at before, which is that a lot of concerns with getting people into studies and keeping people into studies has to do with things that don't really have to do with the science and ethics. It has to do with being able to get to the study site, childcare, being able to park. There's a very famous study that was done a while ago about people's worries about being in clinical trials at the University of Pennsylvania, which is in West Philly. And the authors thought they were going to find things like, well, they don't trust researchers, research is dangerous. And the biggest worry people had was actually parking, and that it's really hard to find parking in West Philly. So this is just one of the examples of the things I was referencing at the beginning, where if we're going to do better with recruitment and retention, we have to take seriously things like awareness of studies, transportation costs, parking, and figuring out who addresses and how we address those concerns. Difficult to reach participants. So sometimes what happens if we aren't proactive, we just end up recruiting whoever finds out about and shows up for our studies. And sometimes that can be effective, but at other times it can potentially lead to a fairly homogeneous group of study participants. And in particular, people who are more difficult to recruit might not just be different, but they might be different in scientifically and medically relevant ways. For instance, they might be sicker, and that's part of why it's more difficult to reach them. So another area in which we need to be proactive and really reach out and try to figure out how to get people into the studies. We can talk about this, people are interested. So one of the proposals, Steve Goodman at Stanford, people might know, is a very big proponent of this, is one of the ways people are proposing to address concerns with recruitment and retention is to go to learning healthcare systems, where basically what we do is we just recruit people in the process of providing healthcare, and research is integrated into the delivery of healthcare. It raises lots of interesting issues. A lecture on its own, but we could talk about some of that if people are interested. The goals are, you could just get more people. If you're doing it with your participants, your patients, you know who they are, you can get them into the study. It could increase, and it could be a lot faster to do these studies. Other possibilities, this is from Scott Kim, one of my colleagues, is what you do is you create cohorts of people who are interested in being in studies. And then when a study comes up, you look in the EHR to see if they're eligible. And if they are, you just recruit those people into the trial. Gotten a lot better at doing e-studies. The number of inpatient people at the clinical center has gone way down in the last couple of years, and the number of people participating remotely has gone way up. And I think that could be helpful in getting people into studies. I think it's going to raise new challenges about retaining them, keeping them in the studies, and getting accurate data from them. Need more data. So very few studies tell you how they tried to recruit and whether or not it was successful. So this was a call for trying to get more reporting. So people have data on different methods they've used, particularly ones that have been effective. I think the literature really needs data on those assessments. Here are some assessments of things that people tried. A lot of them, unfortunately, didn't work. Expanding the sites did work. That was very effective. So to the extent you're having trouble, particularly if you're not getting kind of broad representation, thinking about different sites can be very effective. Doing screening in the EHR and using EHR has also been very effective in some trials. Okay, so that's recruitment. Now let's briefly talk about subject retention. So just like recruiting, we need to retain people to get valid data. One of the suggestions, this I'm realizing this is like our old fellow parade, these references. This is from Owen Schaefer, who is another fellow in our department. Some people think you just pretend that you have an obligation to participate in research. I'm skeptical about whether or not that's going to be effective, and I actually worry that it might be counterproductive. I think a better thing is for us to get better about trying to, as I think about it, turn subjects into participants and trying to do research with the subjects rather than on them, make them a part of the research and emphasize how important we think the research is. I think that can be effective. I think it also raises some interesting ethical issues. So I think what we should be doing a better job of is we should be highlighting why it's valuable to be in research, why the research is important, encourage that, encourage people to stay in the studies, but figure out a way to do that that doesn't undermine voluntariness. That's the challenge. This is a study that Christine Grade and I did a bunch of years ago where we talked to a bunch of people who are in studies and we asked them, did somebody tell you that you didn't have to be in the study if you didn't want to be? And a lot of the people said, yeah, they tell me all the time I don't have to be in the study, but they don't tell me why I should stay in it. And I'm almost going to drop out because I'm wondering if there's not really any point to it. And I think in this regard, at least research ethics has gone overboard in making sure people know they can drop out and they can leave studies without emphasizing sufficiently why the studies are valuable and why there's reasons for them to stay in the studies. So this is one that I think is the most fun questions here is, what sorts of things can we do and what sorts of things would be ethically appropriate to do to keep people in trials? So the third bullet is throw parties. One of the prominent researchers here for a long time had a longitudinal study with about 500 people. He had amazing retention. And one of the things he did every year at the end of the year was he threw a party for everybody. He gave a presentation about the scientific results of the study, encouraged people to stay in, and got them really fun food that everybody liked. And so I think that party. It may not have to be parties, but I think one thing it did do is it really gave people the sense of being part of this cohort that was doing something interesting and something potentially valuable. And I think that's the sentiment we have to encourage more in participants. So obviously how you do payment, I mentioned this before, how you do payment can also be a way of trying to keep people in. Doing completion bonuses can be helpful, but then there's the problem I mentioned before. If too much is built in at the end, you might encourage people to misdescribe their experience so they get that payment. So some data on retention. Unfortunately, a lot of things didn't work. So regular phone calls didn't work. Some people tried birthday cards. They seemed fairly expensive and didn't work either. I think a lot of it is just things like flexibility and in-person contact. And so that's the question of how we're going to do when we have remote and how we're going to be able to keep people in trials. Okay, so that's what I have for today. I'd be interested in everybody's thoughts. And so just to remind everybody, I think recruitment and retention are really not just scientifically important, but ethically, they're really important if we're going to do valuable research, if we're going to make something of everybody's time and effort. But I think there's some real interesting challenges that are in the way of making sure we do this right. All right, thank you. So I think I'll just close this down for now and see how we do. Now I'm happy to bring it back up if somebody has questions about specific slides.
That was great, Dave. Thank you very much. I want to hear others' comments, but I have a couple about some of the points that you raised. I recall when we participated in the process trial, a prospective randomized controlled trial. It was the first one we did in the emergency department. And what we heard was that patients at Washington Hospital Center, they're not going to participate, particularly African-American patients aren't going to participate because there's this distrust and whatever else, which was the furthest thing from the truth that we experienced. What I heard time and time again was, if I can help someone else, I'm happy to do it. It was amazing. We had something like a 60% enrollment rate. It was super high. It was very interesting. My experience has been similar to what you described. There's really been very little distrust that I've experienced.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just say two things about that. I think it is really interesting, but there's so much data that supports what you say, Manish, that if you interview people, they're interested, they're willing, they like the idea of participating and contributing. And so the challenge is to make sure they know that that's what they're doing, make sure they know why the trial's valuable. And I don't know how you guys handle this, but I fight our IRB a lot on this, where there'll be 5-6 pages on the risks, and then there'll be one little sentence about why this might be an important study. And if you're just a normal person and you read that, all that, just psychologically, you got to think, oh, this is just a bad idea for me. And I think we need to do a much better job of that. And I think you're right, then people will respond in the way we're hoping they will.
It's very interesting because I think about the language, the feedback that we give to investigators, and ensuring that the language that's used isn't overly optimistic. Isn't and I wonder if we're doing the right thing or not based on your comments. But let me let others speak. Les. Les, go ahead.
Sorry, folks. Great talk. At risk of putting you on the spot in the context of all this great information, then what is coercion? I thought I knew what coercion was, and now I'm not so sure that I do.
Okay, so there's let me say two things, and let me know if I answer your question. So part of this is, though, some people might remember, I'm trained as a philosopher. So I'm going to give you the philosophical answer first. And philosophers understand coercion in a very specific way. And it's typically not the way that most normal people, IRB members or researchers, understand it. So understood in the philosophical way, I think basically coercion isn't a problem. And I'm sort of glad you got that message out of this talk. So let me explain why I think that, and then we can talk about the other things that sometimes people put under the rubric of coercion. So according to philosophers, so maybe one way to think about it is the distinction between coercion and undue inducement is one way to think about it. But according to philosophers, at least, coercion is an action that threatens somebody. So basically, coercion involves threatening somebody that you're going to do something bad to them. You're going to harm them in some way unless they do what you want them to do. So the classic example of coercion is you're walking down the street. I walk up to you, I stick a gun to your head and I say, give me your wallet or I'm going to shoot you. So before I walked up, you had the choice of just walking down the street and keeping your brains and your wallet intact. Now that I'm there, you no longer have the option of doing both of those things, and you're going to lose one or you're going to lose the other. So that makes you worse off than you would have been otherwise. So the analogy in a clinical trial would be something like, all right, I was going to pick on Manish, but maybe I shouldn't do this. So you just have some investigator. So think about it in terms of a learning healthcare system is really where people get worried about this. Imagine I'm a doctor and I bring patients in and I'm running a trial at the same time. And I say to them, if you don't enroll in my trial, I'm not going to take care of you, or I'm going to give you inferior care. That's coercion, because that's a situation in which you're threatening to make somebody worse off if they don't do what you want, for instance, enroll in the trial. So I think, now tell me what you think, but I think that that's almost never a problem. I hope, and I think it's almost never a problem in clinical trials, because I just don't think, I hope I'm right about this, if nothing else. I don't think there are many investigators out there who are literally threatening people to enroll in trials, who are saying, if you don't enroll in trial, I'm going to hurt you, or I'm going to shoot you, or I'm going to take away your medical care. I'm going to take you off the ventilator. I'm going to take you off of dialysis if you don't enroll in my trial. I'm hoping, I think that's not happening. And so in that sense, to that regard, I think coercion just isn't actually a problem in clinical trials. So let me stop there. I can talk about undue inducement, which is what a lot of people actually mean. Philosophers are just nitpicky and they use specific words in specific ways. So just the philosophical definition of coercion, I don't think we should worry about it. But let me just stop and see if people have questions about that. But you tell me what, Les, if you're actually interested in something more like undue inducement, which is more like giving people some promises or offering them something to get them do things. And we could talk about that.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that if I've heard it said that if you offer what some would consider an excessive payment for participation, that represents coercion or could be constructed as coercion.
Yeah, good. So some of this is just semantics. So philosophers would describe that as a worry about undue inducement rather than a worry about coercion. So if I have a trial and I'm trying to get people into my trial, if I say I'm going to hurt you unless you enroll, I'm coercing you. If I say I'm going to give you lots and lots of goodies if you enroll, that's the possibility of undue inducement. And so then the question is, so if we leave coercion to the side, I don't think it's happening. If we leave coercion to the side, let's talk about undue inducement for a second. So what's the worry there? So the worry there is that what might happen is if we offer people too much, then they might do things that are actually bad for them. They might make bad decisions because they're sort of blinded by the offer of money. Just a quick aside for people who are interested in undue inducement in other settings, there was this fantastic article in the New Yorker about 15 years ago about kidney donors in India. And people were offering people in India, just going around India and offering people $2,000-3,000 American dollars to donate one of their kidneys. Now, according to the study, for a lot of people who were offered that money, it was more money than they'd ever heard of. You know, these are people making a couple dollars a day. And they were so excited by the prospect of $2,000, they felt like it would just change their entire lives. They just went and donated one of their kidneys. Then they ended up blowing the money on some huge party and 6 months later regretted it. So that looks like an example, or at least a possible example of undue inducement. It's where you're sort of blinded by this offer and you end up making a decision that's a really bad idea for you. So if we understand undue inducement in that way, the first thing to do is, rather than worry about how much we're paying, instead of worrying about how attractive the offer is, we should worry about making sure that the trials we approve and the trials we conduct aren't a really bad idea for anybody who's eligible for them, right? So for people who are interested in this, my ex-boss Zeke Emanuel wrote a paper on this where he actually thinks undue inducement isn't a worry at all. Now, I think he exaggerates a little bit. Zeke tends to do that, but his point was, look, if we have a really good IRB like they have at Washington Hospital Center, and if Washington Hospital Center's IRB does its job, and it makes sure that the people who are eligible are people for whom enrollment makes sense, including makes sense with respect to risks and benefits. So in other words, either the risks aren't too high or the potential benefits justify the risks, then we don't have to be really worried, because it's not going to be possible for anybody to make a terrible decision, right? So if the studies we're approving are minimal risk, low risk studies, or they're studies that really do offer a prospect of benefit that justifies the risks, then no matter how much we offer, even if somebody's sort of blinded by the offer because it's so attractive, they're not going to be able to make a terrible decision for them because it's not possible given the IRB review. Now, if that's right, then it suggests one thing: rather than focus on the amount of the money or the nature of the offer, is to make sure that we're approving studies only when they're appropriate for everybody who's eligible. And a lot of times we can do that. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes there are studies for which you just can't. We used to have this clinician on IRB who would say, I can't tell you whether this is right for everybody. I need to know the person's exact history, what medications they've taken over the last 5 years, what their BMI is, what their ejection fraction looks like, on and on. Now, if that's true for some studies you approve, if there's studies for which you think this could be a really bad idea for certain people, then what we used to do is we used to require an assessment by a clinician of the specific individuals to make sure that enrollment made sense for them. So if that's the worry, I think the suggestion is we could talk about what's too excessive in terms of an offer. But remember, offers actually do work in terms of getting people into trials. So I think rather than worrying too much about the size of the offer, I'd worry more about the nature of the study and making sure it's appropriate for everybody. Okay, so now let me stop. That was a long answer to a simple question, so I apologize for that. But I don't know if you wanted to have any other thoughts on that.
Dave, this is great. I've got a list of questions. I've got a list of topics for which we're going to ask you to come back. But Ben's very patiently had his hand up.
I'm just going to say, for every talk I give, Ben has to buy me one more beer. So it was one for the last, now it's two. So I keep coming back, but he's going to have to give me undue inducements at some point of like a case.
You're on, Dave. You're on. I'm going to expense the beers, by the way, Nish. Yeah. So I mean, I'll just. I think my main takeaway from what I've heard from you so far, Dave, is you're more worried that we might not be offering enough inducements to get enough people enrolled to have scientifically valid and legitimate studies than that we're offering inducements that are too high, and obscuring people's judgment.
Yeah.
And I see you nodding. So I just wanted to recap that and see if I was understanding that correctly. And then the question that I had, I wanted to see if you had kind of an ethics take on some of these issues that you mentioned in terms of like, what are the ethics of the font size, or how prominently you display certain information about like the perks of the study. How do you think about that, when you're on the IRB as an ethicist? And then, one kind of related discussion that we've had a few times in our IRB, there's the question of, what goes in the advertisement, and also we've talked about other than payments to participants. Is it inappropriate, or is it appropriate to highlight if we're offering kind of like a free medical treatment as part of the study? Should you be disclosing the market value of the free treatment that you're giving, right? So that's kind of been a point that's come up a few times before, where like the concern is, if we say, oh, if you were to get this outside of the study, it would cost $4,000. Maybe that's too much of an inducement.
Right. So let me just say, for your first point, Ben, I basically agree. I think we should, if anything, probably be offering more incentives. But there's a broader point too, where it's not just, because of Les's question, I was focused on incentives there, but I think there's the broader point of, I think we need to look at all the different ways of getting people into trials and keeping them in trials and doing a better job. Incentives and payments are one of them, but as Manish said before, I think for a lot of people, they're much more motivated, not so much by the money, but they really are interested in helping, but they want to know that this is a valuable study and it makes sense for them to participate in this study. So that's another kind of incentive. It's not a monetary or fiscal incentive, but just making clear to people are interested in helping out when they can. And so thinking about it in just a very broad way about what's going to bring people into the study. And then what are the obstacles? What are keeping them out? How can we increase the one and decrease the other? With respect to font size and things, I don't think I have anything. I have no idea. What we used to do in our IRB is we'd all look at it, and they would have ads. There were a lot of radio ads, there were a lot of TV ads, and we had a big screen in the IRB room, and they would play it, and then we just all talk about it. The problem with those is just, I was just always amazed. Everybody has such different responses to that. Some people are like, yeah, that's great. And other people are like, that's completely ridiculous and unethical. And so I don't have standards for those kinds of things. My guess is we're probably going to have a really hard time ever developing them. And so my inclination, as I was suggesting before, although we should still make sure we're not permitting things to go through that just seem patently ridiculous, other than that, I'd be more interested, rather than focusing on exactly the font size, we should ask ourselves, what are we worried about? And then see to what extent we can address those worries. So one of the worries I mentioned before is, and this I think is a legitimate worry, there's a lot of good data that people who enroll in clinical trials often just don't understand the basics of the trials they're enrolling in. And so I think we need to do a better job of making sure that people understand. And so don't worry about the font size in the ad, but make sure you've got a consent process that's going to result in people understanding at least what you think are the basic important things. And I don't know if everybody thinks this is too much, but I've argued in the past that we should consider, for studies particularly that we're worried about in this regard, just having a quick comprehension test. When I sat, I don't know if I mentioned this before, so I used to sit on the drug abuse IRB, the NIDA IRB, and I convinced people, we actually ended up, for that IRB, every study that went through that IRB had to include a comprehension test. And everybody who enrolled in the study had to pass the comprehension test. And so at least at that institute, it worked. I think we did it, and I think it really made a difference. And we could talk more about how you facilitate those, how you do this questions. But so that's one I think you should focus more on. Understanding is one of the things. Another thing I think is just voluntariness, which could be part of that assessment. Do you want to be in the study? Why do you want to be in the study? Do you have any worries? There's a really interesting study about 15 years ago from South Africa where they asked a bunch of people, do you realize being in this study is voluntary? And something like 90% of the people say, yeah, I know it's voluntary. And so you might think, oh, okay, we're good. Well, they were clever enough to ask this follow-up question, and they asked people, okay, it's voluntary. What do you think would happen if you said no, you didn't want to be in the study? And a bunch of people said, if I said no, my doctor would do bad things to me. And so that's really concerning, right? We don't want that going on either. So I think it's more of one, assessing the real understanding of the subjects. And the other thing is the thing I said before. If you're confident that anybody who passes your inclusion-exclusion criteria, anybody who passes the inclusion-exclusion criteria, for those people being in the study makes sense, then I don't think we have to be too worried, right? But if there are people for whom, look, this study could be really, really dangerous, or this study could be a terrible idea for certain people, then we need to figure out ways to screen them out. And I think just worrying about font size isn't very effective anyway, right? Some of those people might slip through anyway. And so we have to figure out ways sort of more proximate to the study to do that. So I'm more worried about understanding on the one hand, and then sort of risk-benefit profile for the specific people who are eligible for the trial.
And Dave, I know we're well past our time, but what about that last piece that Ben brought up of sharing the dollar amount, the dollar value of, say, a medical treatment? What was your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I guess my first thought would be, I'd want to hear more about the example. I'd want to hear more about the trial. And I'd want to hear if people thought that sharing that information might be problematic on one of those two counts. Is it possible that people aren't going to understand the trial and consent to it anyway? Or are there people who you think they're eligible, but actually for some of these people, so I'm a philosopher, so I can't make up the details, but right, they have a certain comorbidity where if they're in this trial, it'd be really dangerous for them, or they have septic shock, whatever it is that they have. If there's certain people for whom this is a bad idea, then I'd be worried. But if you said, no, we have a way to make sure people understand, one. And two, we're confident that anybody we put in this trial, it's appropriate for them from a risk-benefit point of view. Then for that specific trial, I'm less worried. I will tell you one other problem, though. We've done a lot of conferences. We've done about 85 conferences in developing countries. And we did a couple conferences in a row in East Africa. And we talked about payment. And a couple of us, they're a couple of my colleagues, we typically don't agree on very much, but actually, surprisingly, most of us agree on payment. We're not that worried about payment. But what these guys found out was that there was a kind of escalation that went on within a community where, so if you offered, $10 for this study, then next time around, people are like, yeah, this guy over here is offering $10. I need at least $10 if I'm going to enroll in your trial. So you need to be aware of what the effects are going to be on other studies. Just the last thing, which I assume this isn't going on at Washington Hospital Center, but you might be worried, right, if this is sort of the learning healthcare worry, that we're going to do research in the context of providing healthcare, and then what we're going to do is we're going to be really, really strict on who we give healthcare to. We're going to start knocking people off giving me healthcare, but then we're going to say, oh, but if you're in our trial, we'll give you that healthcare. And by the way, it's worth $7,500 or something like that. I'm really worried about that case, but it's not so much that you're telling them how much it's worth, but it was all the other things that went on behind the scenes.
So I have a very long list here on topics for us to discuss next time. Dave, that was really outstanding. I'm not even going to ask if there's other questions because we're well over our time. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us, and hopefully we'll have you back in the near future.
That would be great. That was great. Nice to see everybody. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Ben, coordinating. Diamond? I see your hand up, Diamond. Is that not? No.
That was
okay.
a mistake.
Okay, great. All right, good. Well, yeah, that was great. And I feel like we could easily talk for a few hours. There's so much to talk about, everything that he brought up. Like, we've got real world examples here that I'd love to hear his thoughts about. But thanks again, Ben, for coordinating. A few things before we jump into our item to discuss. I wanted to mention that we're in September. In October, my hope is to meet with all of you one-on-one, just to hear how the year went for you, and kind of check in and see if there's things that you think we should be doing differently. Along those lines, where we have had several folks reach out wanting to join the IRB. And I think that what we'd like to do is have it all done at once. So if there's people that you know that have talked to you about joining, people that you think would be good members or good additions, I should say, please feel free to reach out to them or reach out to me or Jim, and we can work on trying to get folks who are interested and bring something positive to the IRB added. And so expect an email from me probably in the next couple of weeks to schedule for October.